Hello, welcome to LoFi Bedtime Very Tales. I hope you are thinking, feeling, and behaving well. In this episode, I will tell you all about a dragon named Brad, his sardonic sidekick Sparkles, a girl named Iris, and a kitten named Anthony. Since this tale has more words than any other I have shared thus far, I have made the decision to keep it simple. Just words and accompanying music. The lesson from the story is that we cannot always think that the way someone looks means that they will be that way. I have known some very friendly appearing people in my days who were as mean as salt is salty. So, with that being said, we must always try to not judge people, animals, or meals by the way that they look, but instead on how they behave and how the food tastes. You know what I mean, my little spicy pinto bean? Accepting is easier to do than judging, and feels so much better too. And that reminds me to remind you that we should always do things today to make tomorrow better. Brad with the bad breath. Somewhere and sometime there was a land filled with people and wonderful creatures. It was a time when the only things that lit up or illuminated the world were the sun and fire. People really counted on both of these things to warm them up and dry things out, too. The sun was as predictable as it has ever been. Fire, however, was not quite the same. People had discovered how to start and keep a fire going in most places at most times on land, yet no one was able to figure out how to start a fire underwater yet. But that's a whole nother story involving chocolate sauce, a purple balloon, and a mouse named Henri. Henri likes to tell his own story, so I'll leave you suspended in suspense until you speak with him. He's available on Tuesdays. Now, back to our tale that is about learning who someone is before making decisions on who you think they are, and more importantly, before you treat them based solely on their appearance. Near the foothills of mountains, no longer named what they were back then, was a village named Schondorf. It was a lovely place. It rained a lot there, and most mornings it was very foggy. The air was as clear as creamy potato soup. The people in this village all had their special jobs which helped out one another. The baker was covered in flour most of his waking hours. The cobbler made and repaired those things you wear on your feet over your socks. And the potter spun her wheel to create the bowl in which your porridge was plopped. There was even the fire master. But whoever had this job started fires. They didn't stop them. It had become more of a critical issue to maintain fires in the past few years because the wood wasn't drying out as well as before, and the villagers wouldn't cut down all the trees in the forest. There were other folks with jobs too, but I think it's best for me to stay focused, so I'll stop with those I've already mentioned. The residents of Schondorf typically enjoyed one another's company and respected one another. People would heed the blacksmith's word on metalworks and give her the benefit of a doubt on most other matters, too. There would be a big celebration once a year. The Harvest Festival was a jolly hoot, and someone almost always ended up wearing an empty mead bucket for a hat. But we won't speak about Mrs. Johnson anymore in case one of her ancestors is reading. There was one major concern the village people had, and it had nothing to do with how to sing and dance with one another whilst promoting the benefits of free lodging. This matter had a history of being very dangerous. At the summit of Mount Moritz was a cave. Kind of spooky on its own, don't you think? Inside of the cave lived a fire-breathing dragon. Always. It was like a regulation for the dragon community. Earth was divided into designated zones, and dragons were required to monitor and terrify all those who lived in their areas. For many years, there was a dragon named Hexa who was quite menacing. She delighted in scaring the spit out of the villagers. She was as large as the barley field and would burn it right before the harvest if she thought it may amuse her. It seemed her teeth grew a foot every time she did that. Her eyes were like red diamonds, and they could place anyone into a hypnotic trance if they dared to look into them. Her tail stretched longer than the deepest well in the kingdom and was just as dark. Her wings may not have been as big as a pirate ship's sails, but they could stir people up off the ground so her tail could hit them like a bat hitting a ball. Her skin was a blemished brown with sagging scales that had begun to furnish a foul, fetid fragrance that could bring a person to pass out. Hexa's pure presence precluded the villagers from going further outward to other areas that were more dry in order to get dry wood, for they feared her relishing and tormenting them. It's amazing that they were able to go about their daily affairs at all with all of that potential for panic. Once, a little girl who was named after a flower had seen her while napping in a treehouse. The girl thought to herself that Hexa was so angry because she was, well, what's a nice way to say ugly? The girl knew that we are all born just as we are, but she thought that Hexa may have taken it a bit too far because of her appearance that no one wanted to appear. There were several times a year that Hexa flew away to spend time with other dragons, and guess what? Those times became the times when people would celebrate together freely and without a dragon's care in the foothills. Hexa ravaged Shondor for several generations, and she was quite bored with it. She longed to be out of the rain and the mountains and informed the Dragon Council of her decision. One morning, Hexa woke up to find her replacement had been surreptitiously dropped off overnight. Her replacement was still in its original packaging, an egg. Hexa was a bit peeved, as she was like a doctor on holiday. She had no patience. She breathed on the egg to keep it warm for 73 hours. The shell began to crack, and then it fell to the floor of the cave. Inside was a dragon whose coloring was black with emerald eyes and a cornflower tuft of hair sprouting out of its chin. Hexa was incredibly jealous. Its first breath was a torrent of flame that smelled like other things that come out of other babies. Hexa snarled at this stench and was envious of its immediate ability to breathe fire. She yelled,
"Hey, you little stinker, just who do you think you are?"
It looked over at her as if it had just noticed her and replied, "Brad. I think I'm Brad. At least that's what my inner voice is telling my outer voice to create. And who might you be, my lady?" Hexa replied,
"Never you mind. I'll be leaving tomorrow. I'll give you the details about here and be on my way. I'm sick of this wet place. It makes my hide hideous."
Brad grinned and offered, "Right on. I can dig it." She informed him of the year's supplies of smoked carrots, beets, sweet potatoes, and radishes she had stashed in the cave. Oh wait, maybe you heard that dragons eat people. No, silly. Sky dragons are vegetarians. There are two other types of dragons. There are desert dragons, and they eat snakes and other things that survive in the sand. Additionally, there are snow dragons that some think were probably the first dragons. Snow dragons are the ones who will eat people, but they went into permanent hibernation long before people had even made up 5 words to say. Hexa and Brad flew around the area. Hexa informed Brad on the most efficient and exciting ways to terrify the villagers and dash their hopes around harvest season. It rained all day. She seemed to complain about every single drop that fell upon her. He enjoyed how the precipitation made him feel as slick as an eel, the dragon's long-lost cousin of the deep. She took mean pleasure in not telling him that his baby stinky breath would fade away in the upcoming months. Hexa didn't have to tell Brad about a lot of things because dragons are born with an almost immeasurable knowledge about all types of animals and where everything is on Earth. He knew that he was supposed to make the people miserable and fill them with fear. In his mind, it just didn't seem or feel right to him. He felt like he was just a big, fuzzy, furry thing inside. It seemed like he was being told to be something he was not, and he started manifesting negativity, and that felt wrong to him. He told himself just to take his time and he would figure everything out. He would still be a dragon, but he would menace the Brad way. Hexa didn't wish him a good night, and he wasn't surprised that he woke up with her already gone. He gazed out of the entrance of the cave overlooking the valley and saw his new home. He liked it, and then it started to rain, and he adored it. The cave was really dry to him, and the air tickled his throat a bit. He tried to clear it with a small cough, and it didn't work. So he then began to make fire puffs that would turn into smoke rings that would float across the horizon. This distracted him, and he felt as cool as a fool playing pool and flouting the rules for Jules in school. He lounged about the cave for a few days. After having a few bites of smoked root vegetables, he liked to mix up sweet potatoes and beets in his mouth and stick out his tongue to see the blended color. Afterwards, he'd take some night flights of fancy. Even in the cold rain and creamy clouds, he was fascinated with the area. He wished he could swoop down and skim right over the surface of the lake, but he wasn't too certain of his fine motor skill abilities yet, and he didn't want to startle anyone. He wanted to see what he looked like. He was just curious. He hoped he looked like he was as friendly as he felt happy. It should be noted that he was growing 77 centimeters a day, so he was a bit wobbly growing into his body. On his third night, he woke up to something buzzing in his left ear. He opened his left eye and turned his head to the left. Smack straight in front of his eye was a flying creature. It was the size of a radish and greenish purple. It began to speak.
Well, it's about time you woke up, Sleeping Beauty. I was beginning to think I'd have to dive bomb your nostrils with my magic gas to get you out of your slumber. I was named Angela, but I prefer to be called Sparkles. I gave myself that name since I think that I just dazzle everywhere I go. I'm kinda easy on the eyes, too. Nice to meet you, Brad. I lurk about in the cave. I used to aggravate Hexa so bad, and it was so good. That was her name, by the way. I was so not surprised that she wouldn't take a sec to tell you that. Gosh, she could find a reason to complain about the amount of time it took to complain. She could really drag on and on with her carps and her whines, and I thought I was the long-winded winged one. I am a babbling bird, heard. She thought she should have been made Queen of the Dragons or something better sounding. I felt bad for her at first, and then the more time I was around her, I just felt bad.
Brad was nodding right along with all of Sparkle's sentiments and began, "Well, it's nice to meet you. I was starting to get kind of lonely. I don't think I was made like most of the other dragons, and I feel okay with that." Sparkles provided.
Well, it takes all kinds of everything to make this world. Even though there aren't more than 200 villagers below, there sure are a lot of different types of them. Take me, for example. Most hummingbirds, that's actually what I am, even though you didn't ask, are really sweet and try to please everyone and all of that rubbish. But I'm not like that, though. I can be. I'd like it to be easy for me to be that way, but I'm just not. I have a dry disposition and a wet way of telling others what I think. What I mean is, what I say sticks around for a bit.
Brad observed. "Sounds like you tell it like it is. I'm hip to that. So what's it like down there? Are the people really going to be scared of me?" Sparkles flew all around him and got back center focus in front of him and tersely informed,
Yes.
Brad returned, Man, really? Sparkles explained,
Unless you stop growing now and start looking like a long-haired golden hound, you are as black as a heart without hope and look like you'll be so big that people will think of Hexa as a runt.
Brad belched out, Bummer! He looked to be entering the first stage of dejection when Sparkles offered,
Just take it easy, Sunshine. This is your region. You make all the rules, right?
Brad answered, Yeah, pretty much, Sparkles. Hexa told me that I have to visit the Dragon Council once a year. They measure my fire output and it has to have been used to burn things, not just to, breathe it out for grins and giggles. Don't ask me how they do it, they just do. If I don't meet the requirements, especially after the big burnout at harvest, well, she said that I won't have to worry about planning my next meal. Sparkles succinctly spat.
Ouch.
Brad gestured his snout towards the entrance of the cave and muttered, Well, it was nice to meet you, Sparkles. Come by tomorrow, but I have to crash. I'm totally beat. These growing wings really take a ton of energy to make a few feet of wings, you know. Sparkles said,
I get it. Good night, Brad. Oh, I've got to do something about that name. One more thing. It would be a good idea to eat some of that smoked ginger you have over there. Your breath smells like a barn that hasn't been cleaned in a cow's age. Let me put it like this. I'd rather ask Hexa what's bothering her than come back in here. Get it? Garlic that has been passed through a pig has a less noxious or odious odor than what you have been breathing out. Perhaps I could compose a sonnet or a haiku to get my point across.
Brad was a bit steamed by all of this, so he let some steam out of his mouth. Sparkles snickered.
That's my cue, Braddy Pooh. See you on the morrow.
Later that night, Brad flew over the village. He admired how well everyone maintained their homes and their property despite all of Hexa's antagonistic acts of arson. It smelled and seemed smokier than in previous days. He made a mental note to ask Sparkles about that. He really wished he could land and look around and maybe just talk to someone. He felt in his heart that he could be friends with the villagers. Instead of making that dramatic choice, he just hovered over the lake, feeling the soft rain tickle his scales. Every now and then, he could see part of his menacingly appearing reflection through the foggy air, and he didn't like it. He didn't feel like how he looked. After some time, he soared home. He was getting more skilled, and he was proud of this. Not too proud. That night, Brad dreamt of dancing in the air and singing with music in his ears. He couldn't make out what all the hullabaloo was about, but he sensed a shared feeling of joy. He liked it and fell into a deeper, reposeful slumber. Brad woke up with Sparkles sticking her beak right above his left nostril. This tickled him and was a negative way to start the day. Brad expressed his frustration and decided to ask Sparkles about the village history. Sparkles was thrilled to provide this information as she loved to squawk. Remember? It seemed there had been a time when it was not as wet as it is now. The villagers were able to grow more types of crops, there was much less flooding, they could keep fires burning for longer with less wood, and so on. There were certainly a lot of changes that had to have happened due to the rain and dampness. Brad reflected and said he wished he could help. Sparkles snickered and blurted out,
How and why? You've got your work cut out for you, Bradley Britches.
Brad innately kept his cool and delayed replying, for he knew he would respond with anger, and Sparkles seemed to buzz off of negativity and nonsensical nincompoopery. Brad sat silent. Sparkles took the cue, read the cave, and saw the sign, and left the opposite of right. Brad deliberated as best as he could on what future lay in front of him. Was his life really going to be mostly lounging in this cave with a busybody bird blathering on in blustering bombast? Would he have no interactive contact with anyone else other than attending the council? And to complete the rhetorical trilogy of questions, would he really just instill terror and harm innocent people's property? It sure didn't feel right to him. His nature seemed to want to get along and help, not hinder, harass, and harm. Brad had some gifts, flying and fire breathing, and he could certainly use them to boost benevolence. Brad made another late sojourn to the village. The rain had stopped, and he was cautious to be more stealthy since he did not have the pitter-patter of the raindrops deafening out his presence. He decided to perch himself on the top of a particularly tall oak tree. He landed and secured his grip on a broad branch to steady himself when he saw someone. Their eyes met and their mouths opened without a sound. Brad was looking into the eyes of a girl who was about 65 feet up in that tree. Brad freaked a bit and decided to breathe through his nostrils. He thought of Sparkle's caution. Brad grinned without exposing his fangs and then whispered, "I'm Brad. I will never hurt you. I'm not made that way. Will you please tell me your name?" The girl had tears streaming down her cheeks, and she muttered,
"Iris. I am Iris. Please don't burn me. I love my family, and we have a new kitten."
In Brad's mind, he imagined what the kitten looked like and wished he could pet it to get its little motor purring. Brad provided, "I promise I will never hurt you or anyone. I'm new here and I'm still growing. I'm lonely, and that doesn't feel good. I have never held a kitten, but I hope to one day. What is your kitty's name?" Iris, in a state of utter shock, answered,
"Anthony."
Then silence arrived and remained. Brad tried to come up with something casual to talk about, but he didn't want to talk about himself and didn't want to ask her a bunch of questions because he didn't want to burden her. Instead, he told her that he was not like Hexa and he wanted to help, but he didn't know how. Brad looked up at the half moon and asked Iris to find out how he could help the village. Iris looked straight into his green eyes and affirmed,
"I will, Brad. Meet me up here in 3 nights and I will have an answer for you."
Brad bounced back with, "I'll see you then." Iris replied,
"I love your goatee, by the way. I wish my hair was that color."
By the time Brad took that compliment, she was gone. Brad floated home and was supremely stoked. He slept well that night. Sparkles came by to wake him up earlier than normal. Sparkles made her morning observation on how much larger and grotesque Brad and his breath had become overnight. Brad updated her on his introduction to Iris. Brad was beaming with joy and a sense of fellowship and remarked on his increasing anticipation of Anthony. Sparkles wore a reaction of simultaneous judgment and condemnation on her beak. She then spoke,
"It's a trap. They're gonna kill you. It'll be Brad kebabs. I detest cats, and especially the cute ones. They want to eat me, Brad. And finally, it ain't halitosis anymore. It's halinosis. Eat a pine tree, please."
Brad was in utter dismay at these claims and possible denial that Sparkles may be correct. Brad protested, "You weren't there. You can't know that to be true. Iris was genuine. I won't let Anthony eat you." Sparkles then asked Brad how many other humans he has interacted with, or how many other anythings for that matter, and then instructed him not to return. Brad thought for a few seconds and then requested Sparkles accompany him to the rendezvous. Sparkles snickered.
"Well, in that case, yes to this mess."
Over the next few days, Brad began to develop better control over his fire-breathing abilities. Brad discovered a stack of slate-colored stones far back in the cave. He performed some temperature experiments on them and learned that he could fire breathe and it would stay hot enough to keep a fire going with less wood needed to heat up an area without producing any smoke. Brad began to belly breathe and conjured up a more intense flame that seemed to go 12 feet beneath the soil. He let the flames loose and turned a muddy swamp into a damp field where the dirt had changed color. Brad was proud of himself, not too proud though, and told Sparkles all about it later that day. Sparkles provided 0 accolades. Instead, Sparkles informed him that Hexa could do,
oh, so much more,
when she was his age. Brad heard the negativity but did not let it bother him, for he knew Sparkles just says whatever she is thinking. On the morning of the meeting, Brad began chomping ginger and mint leaves to try and be courteous. Just as requested, Brad showed up with Sparkles sitting atop his head. Sparkles began telling Iris all about herself, and then Iris politely requested that she stop talking because Iris had to be back home in a little while and not the following year. Iris informed them that there was no dry firewood near the village, there had been poor crops due to swamp soil, and how their homes were almost always smoky inside because the only available firewood they do have is always damp. Sparkles whispered in Brad's right ear that she had thought Iris was very sweet. Brad announced that he had some ideas and appealed for a follow-up meeting in a few days. Iris asked him what he was going to do. Brad grinned and said with boyish confidence, "Just have some faith, babe. I'm on it like butter on bread." Iris reactively laughed, for Brad sounded rad. They bid farewell and went onward towards their respectively different homes. Sparkles hitched a ride back to the cave. She hovered, appreciating Brad, and declared with gallons of gusto,
I am so proud of you, Baron Bradley. Now don't get too happy about it.
Sparkles buzzed off. Brad felt like he was on the verge of doing something helpful and belonging to others. He checked his breath stench level. It was not so awful, and that was okay. Overnight, Brad made good on his word. He dried out all the mushy bogs and tilled them with the tips of his wings to show Iris he meant business. He flew to the second nearest forest and collected as much firewood as he could possibly carry on 5 trips, and then stacked them in the village center for all to share. And to top all of that, he flew low and silent over all the homes and warmed up the orange clay shingles. Brad was so stealthy that he didn't startle the chickens, and the moon was his only witness. After he made it home, he found Sparkles waiting for him. She was snuggled up in a pile of eucalyptus leaves. She woke up declaring herself the Empress of Aromatics and was ready to get acrobatic. Brad said, "On the wings of love, girl," and then asked her to go down to the village and spy a bit to let him know if his efforts were beneficial. Sparkles answered,
Do I have 2 wings and need to be nosy? I'm on it, Mr. B.
Sparkles witnessed that the citizens were invigorated and buoyant in spirit. They were all going on and how rested they were and how warm and dry their homes had become. She overheard several observing that the farming soil now looked, smelt, felt, and tasted, tasted, like when they were a lad not much larger than a gray goose. This all meant something phenomenally promising. The people could not fathom how this had all happened. Sparkles shot back to the cave and spilled the beans to the Brad machine. Brad felt his chest warming and shared this with Sparkles. She retorted,
You done good, kid. Real good.
Brad thanked Sparkles and stated that he had some more things to work on before they'd meet up with Iris again. Brad set off to experiment with his powers, and Sparkles went off to go be hyperactive somewhere else. They all met 2 days later in the tree. Iris remarked on Brad's size increasing in a "you're not really a freak or anything" kind of way. Brad asked why she liked this particular tree. Iris answered,
I used to have a tree house here. My papa made it.
Sparkles interrupted in her wonderful way with,
Where is it, honey?
Iris lamented,
Hexa.
Iris was wearing an extra long cape and pulled it back to make the formal introduction. Brad and Sparkles heard a crackling and then saw the plushy little purr named Anthony. They both knew they were too big or too tiny to hold or to pet the kitten, but they could cherish this encounter nonetheless. Iris let the moment take its course and began,
Thank you. I know that was you who did all of that. Everyone has been so happy and hope has returned. How can I thank you more?
Brad replied, Being here with me and Sparkles is thanks enough. Meeting Anthony is even more. I want to help. I'm not evil and can never be. It's not me. I may look like it, but it's not me. Sparkles added,
Trust me, girl, named after one of my favorite flowers. He's as sweet as nectar. His breath, not so much, although that's getting better. Are you gargling with the hot springs I recommended? Anyway, I'll stop it. It's your conversation. I'm listening, starting now.
Brad informed Iris that he has more ideas and the big surprise, but it can only happen once a year. Brad asked if he could meet her parents to get permission to do more. Iris, beyond her years, told him that it was not the right time yet. Brad remained patient and let her know that he would continue helping, and then slowly lowered his chin so it looked like Anthony was wearing a blue wig. They all chortled as Anthony began to purr with agreement. They then made a pact to meet every 33 days in the tree. Several months later, the fields were bursting with produce ripe for the harvest. Every Monday night, the villagers placed their gifted by Brad firestones outside their front door, and Tuesday morning, it was again heated for the entire week. The naturally dying trees were magically dried out whenever needed so the citizens wouldn't go without firewood. The birds and other animals returned to the area since Hexa had been gone for some time now. Sparkles had more friends to blather on with. While the town still received more rain than it had years before, the moisture seemed to turn into steam and fog and dissipated away instead of flooding and mudding up everyone's life. The villagers were aware that someone or something had been helping them restore their lives to what they once were. This special guest had been requested to present for the Harvest Festival. It was rumored that this special guest had a special gift that would bestow something brilliant upon the villagers once a year. Brad was now fully grown. Dragons grow fast, silly. They're not like Anthony or Iris, you know. Brad was majestic and rather dapper for a dragon. His scales seemed black from a distance, but under the sunlight had a hint of violet to them. His green eyes were still as sparkling as ever, and his lovely tuft of chin hair was now braided together thanks to Sparkles. He had figured out a way to meet his fire goals for the council so he could remain in his post as long as he liked. As planned, Brad floated above the village and Iris stood below him atop a large, chunky, and funky boulder set in the middle of the harvest festivities. Iris then told everyone what Brad had done and who Brad was. In a flash, Iris then leapt off and instructed everyone to just be cool. Everyone gazed in awe of Brad, for Iris was trustworthy, and it all now just made sense. Brad, without any vestiges of the breath of death, focused his soul fire on the boulder and let it rip. It looked like a laser and was over in seconds. What remained was a pile of gold dust. Brad transformed the stone into the rarefied transformative metal. Now, the villagers would be able to help themselves even more by trading the precious powder for valuable commodities. Everyone stood in awe of the gleaming gold as Brad hovered above. The villagers cheered him with a collective huzzah! Meanwhile, Sparkles flew up to him giggling and avowed,
Brad, you are a boss. You have really proven yourself to be who you said you were.
Brad replied, Thanks for that. I'm sure not done, though. We've got work to do for years and years, my little feather-flurried friend. This is only the beginning. As promised, Brad would continue helping Schondorf for many generations until it was time for all the dragons to go into their peaceful retirement. The villagers would use Brad as an example for years to teach people not to judge others for who they appear to be, but instead for who they are inside and what they do on the outside. I'd like to think that if the Schondorfians could make that permanent change with a dragon the size of a city block who could burn down a skyscraper with a burrito belch, then we could all do that too. Even without someone like Sparkles buzzing around and testing our patience.
Brad with the bad breath, ooh, ha, ha. Brad with the bad breath, ooh, ha, ha.
And I wish the best for you.